All right, thank you, John, for priming people for complementizer. If your visual system is like mine, you should see an illusory contour forming a triangle in this figure, right? So this is a visual illusion known as Kniza triangle, and what it shows is that our visual system constructs the representation that goes beyond what's out there, right? And what I'm going to argue today is that something analogous is going on when we speak sentences, namely when we speak embedded clauses, okay? And I'm going to specifically argue that speakers build silent structure, the structure that they don't speak, specifically the no complementizer structures. And I'm going to use structural priming to show that, okay? So that's going to be the argument, okay? Why should you care? Right? So if you take a look at linguistics and psycholinguistics, there are disagreement about what kind of structure we build, and one camp says we build silent structures, and they are very liberal about it, right? So they assume things like traces and copies of unmoved constituents, or they posit silent structures in ellipsis site, or they posit various functional projections that doesn't have any phonology. Right? And obviously, that's not the consensus positions. Other people believe that we don't want phonologically silent syntactic structures, and some theory even adapt an explicit statement against no structures as a guiding principle of theory development. So this question is theoretically informative, and also even if you believe that something like no structure exists, there's no consensus about what kind of no structure actually exists, right? So even if you subscribe to the first camp, it's still a theoretically informative question to ask what kind of no structure actually exists in our mind, okay? And as I said, today's focus is on the no complementizer. Let me just give you an example. So here's a sentence. I believe that the dog is cute, right? And you can remove that without affecting acceptability of the sentence or even the meaning of it. I mean, there may be some slight difference in the meaning, but you know, both sentences are grammatical and they can be used to convey essentially the same information, okay? But often, clauses are assumed to have the no complementizer, even if you don't use an overt version of it, right? So even if you don't say that, I don't know what's going on. Okay, even if you don't say that, you still have the complementizer structure, you just don't hear them or say them, okay? So the question is, do speakers indeed represent the no complementizer as they construct a sentence in their mind? But how do we even test that? Luckily, people have established this tool known as structural priming that can be used to probe this question. So just to give you a brief example of structural priming. So structural priming refers to the phenomena where speakers tend to repeat the syntactic structure they have recently encountered. The common example is dative alternation. So if you have the girl gave the boy the book, or the girl gave the book to the boy, you have a choice. Given the same message, you can use either of those structures to convey that message, right? It turns out that you can bias people to use one structure over the other, right, by exposing them to the same structure in the preceding context. And that happens across many different types of alternation across languages and everywhere. It's everywhere. And that guy sitting over there, back in 2003, did an experiment on complementizer alternation, right? Structural priming experiment on complementizer alternation. And this experiment used memory tasks that's similar to the experiment that I'm gonna introduce. So let me go through the task a little bit. Okay, so in this experiment, you present two sentences and you're tasked to memorize both of them, right? So this is a target sentence, you memorize first. This is a second prime sentence that you also have to memorize, and then you recall the second sentence first and the first sentence second. So what happens here is that because people's memory is lousy, right, so they can't really verbatim recall the sentence. And the reason why they can do the reasonable job is because they understood the message and they reconstruct the surface form of the sentence based on that message. Right? And the question is how the sentence is recalled as a function of the type of prime sentence you get in between the memorization and the recall of the target sentence. Okay? So for instance, if you have the target sentence like the mechanic mentioned that or know that, the antique car could use a tune-up, right? So you have a complementizer alternation here. You are free to use that or not know that. The original sentence either contains that or know that, 50-50. But the prime sentence, sometimes you have that prime sentence. So this is an independent sentence containing the overt complementizer. Or you can have a neutral baseline, which is just a monoclausal sentence without any embedded clause. Okay? Or you have a minimally different clause without the complementizer. So by hypothesis, this contains a no complementizer. And you just measure the frequency of that production in the target sentence recall. And what you see here is that proportion of times people said that given the relevant trials, right? And what you see here is that in the neutral condition, they are about 73% likely to say that. And most interestingly, you are less likely to say that given the no complementizer priming. Notice that this neutral prime doesn't contain that. So this is a priming of the no complementizer, right? So this is just not the absence of the complementizer. It's the presence of the no complementizer. And there's some effect, there may be an effect or not for the opposite direction. People may be primed to some extent by the overt complementizer, right? So given this result, maybe we are already convinced that the no complementizer is real, but that's not necessarily the case, and indeed Vic himself doesn't actually believe this provides evidence for the no complementizer. The reason is because syntactic priming is often explained as the priming of phrase structure configurations, right? So this is probably the most dominant view in the structural priming literature, right? The structural priming reflects basically the priming of something like a phrase structure rule. So let's take a look at the trees, right? So if you have something like believe that the boy has a cat versus believe the boy has a cat, you could write a tree such that you don't have any complementizer structure when you don't have that, right? And you could say that this is what's getting primed in the VIX study, okay? Here, you don't have to assume any no complementizer structure. So that's what I said, okay? But this account makes a prediction, which is that if you change the prime sentence into relative clauses and keep the target sentence as a complement clause, the effect should go away. The reason is because if you take a look at the complement clause structure, this is what you have to assume if you don't have the overt complementizer, right? And if you take a look at the relative clause, and you could, I think the syntactician will get angry at me by drawing this tree, but you could, in principle, write a tree like this, right? So you have a direct TP adjoined to NP, and this doesn't have any no complementizer structure, but critically, if you take a look at the relevant phrase structure, they are not shared, right? So configurational count predicts that there should be no complementizer priming if you change the clause structure from complement clause to relative clause in the prime sentences. Okay, cross-constructional priming is not predicted by that account. Okay, so the first experiment is to test that prediction, right? And to do that, I use a variant of Vic's task, sentence recall, slightly simplified. So you memorize two sentences and you recall the first sentence, right? And people's memory is bad enough so that even with this simplified task, they alternate the complementizer structure. Even when there's a complementizer, they sometimes omit it. Even when there's no complementizer in the original sentence, they sometimes add it, okay? And the question is, how is that affected by what you see as a prime sentence? Okay? And in the field trial, sometimes people ask to recall the second sentence, so they couldn't know which sentence to recall. All right, so the first experiment. Target sentence is something like this, nothing interesting going on. This is just a similar type of target sentence as VIX. The director announced that the actor will be in the new movie, so you have a complementizer alternation. 50% of the time you have that, 50% of the time you have nothing here. Or by hypothesis, you have the no complementizer here. And the prime sentence is sometimes complement clause. So this is essentially a conceptual replication of Vic's study, right? So the professor thought that the student appreciated the idea during the class, or critically relative clause, which is kind of similar in terms of the words used in the sentence. The professor appreciated the thought that the student expressed during the class. And you can remove that here too. Okay? Yeah, so for each clause type, you manipulate whether that is contained or not. And what you see is something like this. I haven't shown you the result yet, right? But y-axis is just percentage of that, right? So how likely you are to say that. And those panels represent the type of target they received. So no means you didn't have that in the original sentence. That means you had that in the original sentence. Overall is just an average of the two. Okay? And in the x-axis, you have no that refers to whether the prime sentence contained that or not. And color is used to indicate the type of clauses you used in the prime sentence. And remember, in the target sentence, it was always a complement clause. Okay? And what you see is pretty clear, right? So there's just a main effect of the complementizer presence in the prime sentences, and there's no effect of basically a type of clauses or interaction with the type of clauses. Okay? So in other words, the priming from relative clause to complement clause is as big as the priming from the complement clause to complement clause. And this doesn't seem particularly consistent with the configurational account of Vic's results. But obviously, if you are reviewer number 2, you might think that, well, maybe in this particular study, not in Vic's study, this may be reflecting just the priming of that, maybe the phonological form that. The experiment 2 is addressing this question by adding something you can consider as a neutral baseline. So here's experiment 2 design, right? So the target sentence is identical to experiment 1, so I'm not going to go through it. The prime sentence is relative clause sentence with that or not. So this is just a baked-in replication of experiment 1. But I added, instead of having a complement clause primes, you have a monoclausal sentence with either the demonstrative that or just a determiner that. Right? So the idea is, if you have that, you have an absence of the phonological form that. If you have that, you have the presence of phonological form that, and those serves as a baseline for the respective conditions. Okay? And the result is also clear, right? So if you take a look at the demonstrative, which is a blue bar, right? There's nothing interesting going on. Maybe there's some subtle effect of having that. So after having that, maybe a slightly more likely to say that as a complementizer. But what's clear is that given the no complementizer or the overt complementizer in the relative clause, you see a clear replication of the effect. And what's most important, I would say, is this difference. Right? So this is comparing the absence of complementizer with the presence of no complementizer, and you see clearly the effect there. So this doesn't seem to be consistent with the idea that, okay, this is what's going on is just a Boolean phonological, I shouldn't say Boolean, but phonological priming of the phonological form that. Right? Okay, so maybe I'm already convinced, maybe by the existence of the no complementizer, but you want to go further than that. So if I seriously take my view that the no complementizer exists in embedded clauses, right, I make various other types of prediction which I can test. For instance, relative clause, even if you have something like who, you should see a complementizer priming effect. No complementizer. The reason is because this who is a WH word that moves by hypothesis to the edge of the embedded clause. And that edge of the embedded clause is a position created by this no complementizer. Okay? So you have a no complementizer here, and if you follow the logic, you should predict that this should prime the no complementizer as it occurs in the complement clause. And that's what I tested in the experiment 3. Target sentence is almost identical, except that I stopped manipulating the presence or absence of that. I can explain the reasoning behind it later. I'm not going to go into it now. So target sentence always contains that this time. And the prime sentence is a neutral baseline, just a pre-nominal adjectival modification, the really lenient professor, or that relative clause, professor that is really lenient, or the who version of it. So minimal pair, just you change that to who. And the result is pretty clear, right? So this is a proportion of that mentions, right? And neutral baseline, that relative clause, who relative clause, and what you can see is basically that this is a no complementizer priming effect. So people are less likely to say that, meaning they are more likely to say the no complementizer. Okay? The most far-fetched prediction I have tested is the contrast between whether clause and if clause. Okay? So if you take a look across languages, there is a correlation between the existence of the vocabulary item, either and whether. So if you, in a language, if you have a vocabulary either, you tend to have the vocabulary whether. If you don't, you don't. That suggests that maybe this whether is a WH phrase. Okay? And if that's the case, then it actually moves to the edge of the embedded clause, and that position is provided by the no complementizer. And in contrast, the synonymous if clause, wonder if the cat loves the dog versus wonder whether the cat loves the dog, if is the complementizer, right? And if that's the case, then you should selectively see the priming effect of the no complementizer selectively from this whether clause. Yeah. No complementizer, yes, no complementizer, no, no complementizer. Meaning-wise, they are almost indistinguishable. Okay, the target sentence is identical to the experiment 3. Prime sentence, if clause, neutral baseline with no embedded clause at all, whether clause, which is a minor variation of the if clause. You just change if to whether, and the result is again pretty clear, right? So whether clause decreases the production of that in the complement clause in the target sentence, okay? Compared to the other conditions, and there's no evidence that if and neutral baseline differs, so this is a no complementizer priming effect. So just to summarize the results so far, the no complementizer can be primed across constructions, right? And that doesn't seem to be consistent with the configurational account of Vic's findings. And the no complementizer priming is not the priming of the absence of the complementizer. There is a no complementizer, and that's present in your mind. Okay? And the relative clause with who and whether clauses, they both contain the no complementizer. This is not a trivial point in terms of the syntactic theory either. Okay? Just to give you a conclusion, just like our visual system construct a representation that goes beyond the input based on the implicit knowledge encoded in the system, speakers seems to also construct a causal structure based on the implicit knowledge encoded in the linguistic system, and specifically the no complementizer structure is imposed even if there's no phonological consequence. Okay? And that means that when we are building a theory of sentence production and sentence comprehension, we should take seriously the theory that posits no elements on phonologically silent structure, even if they don't have any sensory motor consequences. So that's all I got. I'd like to thank my collaborator, Vic Ferreira and Norvin Richard for insights and NSF for funding. Thank you.
Jeff Green, Brigham Young University. So I don't know if there's a way to test this, but so if you were saying, okay, concluding on this, there is a null complementizer. People also talk about in matrix clauses that there's a null complementizer there, but there's never an overt one.
What is
I don't
going
know,
on?
Is there a way that we could use this to try and provide evidence for whether there's one in the matrix clause?
Great question. I meticulously avoided talking about matrix clause, if you have noticed. right? So there's two responses. One is maybe there's a complementizer and no complementizer in the matrix clause, but all of the prime condition contained it, so the difference didn't appear across conditions. One potential theory that predicts something interesting is that maybe matrix clause doesn't by default contain complementizer, but if you WH move something, it starts to exist. If that's the case, I would predict that if you compare the monoclausal WH sentence with declarative sentences, you should see a no complementizer priming for from the WH sentences.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Cool, thanks.
Hi, thanks, Mary Ellen McDonald. You know, the tricky thing about using priming studies, as you and I both know, is that you can prime all sorts of stuff, and you've been really wonderfully careful about controlling lots of stuff. But I want to suggest one other thing that might be being primed in some of your conditions, which is relative clauses or post-nominal modification. And some of your conditions are pre-nominal modification, like the kind and generous professor or whatever. And so do you think that that could be a factor in whether...
Yeah, so one thing that's a little bit confounding about this experiment that you just mentioned is the length difference, right? So I was a little concerned about it because this target sentence always contained that, meaning that if your memory is accurate, you're more likely to produce that, right? And if something is short, right, maybe your memory of the target sentence is better preserved, resulting in more production of that because the target sentence always contained that. So that's a confound. I do have additional experiment that lengthened this neutral conditions a little bit to match up with the other conditions. So I don't think that explains the result because in that long neutral condition experiment, we still see the same pattern. So I don't think that's a factor, but if you do think that there are some other factors that would be confounding, I would really like to know.
Yeah, there's also some prosodic things with and without that, but I'm going to stop because there's lots of other.
Okay.
Hi, Daniela De Santo, University of Utah. I loved this. And my question is a bit unformed, so if it doesn't make sense, wave it away. I was wondering if you're thinking about cross-formalism comparisons, right? So you could imagine that in a CCG kind of world, what you're actually priming is a type shifting operation to get the TP to look like CP-like, and whether you think, well, whether there is a difference at that point if if instead of an empty head you have this kind of category shifting operations, is it really different? And whether you can distinguish these kind of effects.
Yeah, so I mean, it probably depends on which CCG you're talking about. But if you take Steedman style CCG, I think we have difficult. So there's a theory in structural priming literature that uses CCG as a basis for the model of the priming. That's by David Rader's work, and they say that it's slightly different from your conception of priming, but they say combinatorial potential. So the combinatorial category is the locus of the priming. I don't think our data is consistent with that view because they tend to say things like, okay, here, this is and this has the same combinatorial category, right? That and who, because they appear in the same kind of environment. Right? And to the left, to the right, you have the same kind of category, so they tend to say that those are identical things, they just have a different phonology. I don't think that's compatible with our data. That said, your idea of type shifting or some kind of shifting operation being primed, I haven't thought through it. They could explain the result. What I struggle with would be something like this whether-if contrast. It's somewhat difficult to imagine that this can be captured by that kind of view, I would say. But I have to write down the CCG proof to see what kind of exact prediction that I'm generating there, though.
Thank you.
Charles Ling from Indiana University. Thank you, Shota, for this fascinating talk. The question I have is about experiment 2, where you had the review clause condition where you have the thought that the students expressed.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether it's just this particular item you're using, or in all your items you have the thought that, as the antecedent, because as you know, this makes that a potential complementizer itself. So there's a potential 2 ways to go, where say the thought that the student didn't like the class.
I think I do want people to perceive this as a complementizer, right? So this is a condition where I want to make sure that people take that as a complementizer, right? And in this condition, I inserted of to make sure that that cannot be construed as a complementizer. So in all of the sentences I have a nominal that, so the reason why I have thought here is because I want to match the root of this nominal with verbal counterparts in the preceding experiment, and I reused all the material from the preceding experiment. So
yeah.
as a result, I have thought, but I think that being interpreted as a complementizer is not the problem. Indeed, that's actually the feature of the experiment.
Right, but there would be 2 different types of complementizers
Oh,
here,
I see.
right?
You mean
the thought that and followed by a full clause versus the thought that actually is the relativizer.
So that's interesting because Vic actually tested back in 2003 the contrast between the fact that type that, and he didn't find a complementizer priming from the fact that type, right? But it's unclear what to make of it. The reason is because in Vic's study, the priming of that is very weak to begin with, maybe non-existent, right? So what's interesting about his study is that consistently, priming of the no complementizer is there all the time. Priming of that doesn't exist, right? So comparing across, relative clause that versus complement clause that, nominal complement clause that, I don't know if I want to be comfortable making any claim about the potential difference between them. Yeah, but you're right that this can be incrementally construed as a complementizer as it occurs in the complement clause of that. So that is true.
Thank you.
Hi, Shota.
Hi.
I'm Dario from Potsdam. So, I have to say that I'm not on top of, the syntactic priming literature, but I guess, your sentences probably all use, this very uniform template, right? So I wonder, if this is priming abstract syntax, if you change around the order of things a bit, in the sentences, you should still get the effect, right? Because I'm imagining, I'm a participant in this experiment and I keep seeing basically the same sentence, the same template over and over again, right? And sometimes, in the very same position, I get to that, and sometimes I don't get it. So if one would introduce a little bit more variability into the sentences, would you think that the effect would still be there?
I wouldn't. So I have various experiments mixing various types of structures. Sometimes using the analogous task, dative priming with WH movement or without, embedded clause, matrix clause, various types of WH movement, relative clause, and so forth. That affects basically nothing. The position where those relevant structure appear changes quite a bit, no effect whatsoever.
Okay, and even something simple like just adding 2 more adjectives or something, right? Basically.
Yeah, I could do that. But notice that I think if you compare the relative clause and complement clauses, the position changes a little bit too. Right, so the professor thought that, the professor appreciated the thought that, right? So I don't think the surface position explanation would do much in our data. That would be my guess.
All right, thanks.
Awesome, thank you. Hi, Shota, Sarah Phillips from Georgetown. I wanted you to clarify about accuracy measures and whether or not that could actually be a strategy. So I'm not unconvinced that there is this null complementizer, but I'm curious about the motivations for when it would be advantageous to actually overtly pronounce that. So I imagine a strategy in which I would use that as a way to prosodically mark the clause to help me improve my memory of what's happening. So do you see any relationship with that in that situation?
My take is that those factors obviously do matter. Like as we saw in the last talk, that can be a device for postponing some of the productions when you're not exactly ready. And there's some proposal by Rebecca Tolan, for instance, suggesting that it might provide some information, at least in the complement clause context, some sort of meaning, epistemic privilege or something like that. I forgot the name, but those factors obviously do exist, and they don't deny that they do. I think my take is that unless I see evidence, I don't see this effect being interacting with them. Yeah, so I think this is an independent effect that coexists with many other effects that modulate the production of that.
Awesome, thanks.